In the grand halls of Versailles, where golden mirrors once reflected the splendor of absolute monarchy, a darker reflection began to emerge by the year 1774, one of decay, corruption, and human frailty. The man who once carried the title, Louis the Well-Beloved, would die not with reverence, but with revulsion, known simply as Louis the Hated. His death was not only the result of smallpox, but the physical manifestation of a decaying reign. His rotting corpse, abandoned by even the most loyal of his servants, became a grotesque symbol of a monarchy already devouring itself from the inside. The reign of Louis XV stands as one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in European history. A cautionary tale of power left unchecked and responsibility abdicated. His agonizing death in May 1774 was merely the final act in a decades-long tragedy, one that would help set the stage for the most devastating revolution France would ever endure. But to understand the full horror of Louis XV's end, one must return to its beginning, not in a deathbed cloaked in stench and sorrow, but in a cradle of royal expectation. The year was 1715. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had finally died after a reign spanning an extraordinary 72 years. He left behind a legacy of grandeur and a mountain of debt. His great-grandson, Louis XV, just 5 years old, ascended to the throne of the most powerful kingdom. In Europe, an orphan by the age of 2, the boy inherited not only the crown, but the impossible expectations of a nation raised under a single, unchallenged sovereign. In his early years, France was governed by the regent, Philippe d'Orléans. This was a time of relative liberalism and modest economic recovery after the ruinous wars of the previous reign. The child king received the finest education of his age tutors in languages, history, mathematics, military arts, and diplomacy. All reported a sharp mind and promise of greatness. Hope swept through France. The people believed that this young monarch might usher in a new golden age, and for a while it seemed he might. When Louis XV began ruling in his own right in 1723, he was widely admired, handsome, intelligent, and dignified. He embodied the hopes of a weary nation. The nickname, Le Bien-Aimé, the Well-Beloved, was given to him, not sarcastically, but with heartfelt sincerity. After the rigid formalities and authoritarian rule of Louis XIV, the people hoped this new king might bring reform, prosperity, the daughter of the deposed King of Poland, a politically symbolic union, and, by all accounts, a marriage with genuine affection. She provided heirs securing the Bourbon line. Louis XV championed the arts and sciences and supported philosophers and innovators. France remained the cultural heart of Europe, but beneath these early successes were signs few noticed at the time. Louis XV displayed a troubling indecisiveness and leaned heavily on favorites and mistresses for political counsel. Unlike his grandfather, who had fashioned himself as God's representative on earth, Louis showed little interest in the burdens of kingship. His court, once a center of statecraft, began to resemble a theater of personal indulgence. The descent from beloved monarch to despised ruler was not swift, it was gradual, like rot spreading beneath gilded paint. A series of military failures, political missteps, and scandals eroded public confidence. The first major test of his leadership came with the War of the Austrian Succession in 1740, a conflict that would drag on for 8 bitter years. France joined the war to check British power and support Prussia. But what followed exposed the growing dysfunction of Louis XV's administration. Unlike the Sun King's precise military strategies, these campaigns were poorly planned, driven by personal loyalties and confusion. France bled financially, relying on crippling taxes and loans. The once feared French army suffered humiliating defeats, though Louis XV did lead troops in person on occasion, momentarily lifting his popularity. His leadership lacked the clarity and conviction needed for such a crisis. At the same time, his personal life began to overshadow his political one. Pompadour wasn't merely a royal companion, she was a central political figure. Her influence over state policy enraged the nobility and disillusioned the public. The idea that government affairs were being shaped in royal bedchambers rather than council chambers became a national embarrassment. The war ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, which essentially returned all conquered lands to their original owners. For the French people who had sacrificed so much, this felt like betrayal. The nickname Well-Beloved began to sound hollow. Louis's response to criticism was to retreat. He withdrew into a private world of courtiers and favorites who insulated him from the reality outside Versailles. The growing disconnect between ruler and ruled became more obvious by the day, and then came the 7 Years' War, a global conflict that would become one of France's greatest humiliations. The war saw France face off against Britain and Prussia, in battles stretching from Europe to the Americas. Poorly prepared and strategically misled, France lost vast territories, including Canada and Louisiana. The dream of a French global empire collapsed, and Louis XV was left holding the ashes. But the real price wasn't measured only in land. The war plunged France into deeper debt. To pay for it, taxes were raised, again always falling hardest. On the common people, the nobility and clergy, protected by privilege, remained untouched. The tax system became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Ancien regime. Unjust, outdated, and rigged for the elite. Any hope of reform was crushed by the king's apathy and the entrenched interests surrounding him. Even when advisors urged change, Louis lacked the will. As the war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, France had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. The king, who had once inspired so much hope, was now blamed for the country's decline. Louis XV spent his final years consumed by personal pleasure. He built private retreats like the Petit Trianon for his mistresses, hunted obsessively, and became increasingly disconnected from governance. His life became a spectacle of indulgence, even as the kingdom around him teetered on collapse. By the time smallpox struck him down in 1774, few mourned his passing. His body decayed so rapidly and violently that even his servants refused to remain in the room. The stench of his corpse seemed to echo the spiritual and political decay of his reign. The man once adored had become a symbol of everything France loathed. His death didn't mark the end of an era. It was a warning shot for what was to come, because Louis XV didn't just leave behind a dying monarchy. He left behind a time bomb, and within 15 years, that bomb would explode into the French Revolution. During the mid-18th century, the influence of royal mistresses on French politics reached unprecedented levels. Chief among them were Madame de Pompadour and, later, Madame du Barry, women who were far more than mere companions to the king. These mistresses held real sway over government decisions, involving themselves directly in matters of war, diplomacy, and domestic policy. This dynamic provoked outrage across French society. The traditional nobility resented their diminished influence, while common citizens saw the situation as yet another symptom of the monarchy's moral and institutional decay. When key political positions appeared to be awarded based on personal relationships rather than competence, confidence in the royal administration eroded. Religious tensions only deepened the crisis. In 1764, Louis XV supported the expulsion of the Jesuits from France, a move that pleased some but alienated many of the monarchy's traditional Catholic supporters. Meanwhile, the king's scandalous personal life and the overt power of his mistresses offended the devout, who increasingly viewed him as unfit to bear the title eldest son of the church. This erosion of religious legitimacy proved to be especially damaging. Economically, the kingdom was in steep decline. Since the beginning of Louis XV's reign, financial troubles had persisted, and by the 1760s, they had worsened. Structural issues remained unresolved. The tax system was unjust and inefficient. National debt continued to balloon. Archaic privileges and regulations stifled economic progress. The king's seeming indifference to these issues alienated the rising bourgeoisie and reform-minded nobility, who saw economic renewal as essential to France's survival. As conditions deteriorated, social unrest became a common sight. Food shortages and widespread poverty led to riots and protests across the country. The government's response was often brutal military force instead of reforms, fueling even deeper resentment. Where once the king had been seen as a paternal protector, he now appeared as an oppressor. At the same time, the Enlightenment was reshaping public consciousness. Thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau began challenging the very foundations of absolute monarchy. Their works, initially confined to intellectual salons, began to reach broader audiences. Louis XV's failures, both personal and political, seemed to embody everything these philosophers criticized: tyranny, decadence, and incompetence. Attempts to suppress these new ideas only backfired, stoking further interest and casting the monarchy as hostile to truth and reason. One moment that laid bare the depth of public anger came in 1757, when a man named Robert Francois Damiens attempted to assassinate the king. Though the attack was unsuccessful and condemned, Damiens' testimony revealed motivations that struck a chord with many, showing that, in some quarters, even regicide had become a sympathetic concept. Internationally, the humiliation continued. France's failure to intervene during the partition of Poland, despite strong historical ties, underscored the nation's declining diplomatic influence. Foreign policy under Louis XV seemed reactive, driven more by personal alliances and court drama than national strategy, further tarnishing the monarchy's image by the late 1760s. The disconnect between ruler and ruled had grown dangerously wide. Louis XV governed a nation that had largely lost faith in him. The mounting economic, political, and social tensions that would eventually erupt into revolution were already in plain view, but the king, whether through complacency or incapacity, did little to stem the tide. The 1770s began with France, still staggering under the burdens of its king's failures. The national debt had reached astronomical levels. Finance ministers came and went, each promising reform, only to be blocked by entrenched elites and the king's wavering support. Social unrest grew worse. Bad harvests led to food shortages and bread riots. The poorest bore the heaviest tax burdens, while the aristocracy remained sheltered. The contrast between widespread suffering and the opulence of Versailles had never been more striking. Meanwhile, stories of court excess, some exaggerated, but many true, spread like wildfire, stoking rage among the people. At the center of these scandals was Madame du Barry, the king's final mistress. Unlike her predecessors, du Barry made little effort to conceal her origins or her ambitions. Her open crudeness and blatant influence became a symbol of the monarchy's moral collapse. Religious opposition surged as well. Louis's support for dissolving religious orders and his moral behavior alienated the devout. His decision to exile the Paris Parlement, key judicial body, and replace it with compliant alternatives only heightened fears of absolutist overreach. As Enlightenment ideas continued to spread, they found an increasingly receptive audience. Writings that questioned divine right monarchy and proposed democratic alternatives gained ground. For many, Louis XV had become the living proof of the dangers of unchecked royal power. Internationally, France's failures mounted diplomatically. Weak and militarily diminished, the kingdom faltered in the face of European crises. The king's decisions appeared driven less by national interest and more by personal whims. By the early 1770s, Louis XV's health began to fail. Though he continued his rituals of court life, hunting ceremonies, observers noted that he appeared aged, worn down by decades of misrule and criticism. Yet few could have imagined that his death would be as grotesque and symbolic as his reign had been disastrous. Meanwhile, popular culture had turned against the monarchy. Songs, pamphlets, and satirical works mocked the king as a feeble, sex-obsessed figurehead. Once celebrated in art and literature, Louis XV was now a subject of public scorn. The groundwork for revolution was fully in place. The government was bankrupt. The monarchy's moral and political legitimacy was gone. Society teetered on the edge of collapse. All it needed was a spark. In April 1774, while at the Petit Trianon with Madame du Barry, Louis XV began to feel unwell. What first seemed a minor illness quickly escalated. He complained of headaches, fever, and fatigue. What followed would not only end the reign of Louis XV, it would mark the symbolic death of the Ancien regime itself. At first, the symptoms were brushed off signs of exhaustion, his doctors said, the natural toll of a king burdened by the relentless demands of court and governance. But within days, the truth became undeniable. The king's condition was deteriorating rapidly, And it wasn't fatigue, it was something far worse. On April 28th, the unmistakable signs of smallpox appeared. The dreaded pustules began forming. On Louis XV's skin, in the 18th century, smallpox was not just a disease, it was a death sentence. It respected neither crown nor coin, cutting down both paupers and princes alike. Versailles, the glittering jewel of royal power, was suddenly a house of dread. Panic swept the court. Nobles fled. The corridors that once echoed with laughter and intrigue now whispered only fear. Louis XV's physicians men like Dr. Bordeaux and Dr. Lasson, among the most respected in France, were helpless. There was no cure. The medicine of the day offered only bloodletting, purging, and fumigation treatments that may have hastened the king's demise rather than delayed it. All around him, those who remained could only watch in growing horror as the monarch's body was overtaken. What followed was a transformation as grotesque as it was symbolic. The once handsome king, whose presence had once defined French elegance, became unrecognizable. The smallpox pustules ravaged his body. They swelled and burst, releasing a putrid stench that made his chambers unbearable. Lifelong servants turned away, some refused to enter at all. Even his doctors struggled to stay in the room long enough to tend to him. Versailles, the palace of sunlight, ceremony, and splendor, had become a tomb, but the physical suffering was only part of the king's agony. For a man who had long been obsessed with appearances, the psychological toll was perhaps even more severe. Mirrors were ordered removed from his chambers, for he could no longer bear to see the face staring back at him. It wasn't just death he faced, it was humiliation, disfigurement, and the utter collapse of the royal image he had so carefully cultivated. As his health declined, so too did the court around him. The elaborate etiquette that once structured every moment of life at Versailles began to unravel. Ceremonies were abandoned. Courtiers vanished. Even basic functions of royal life became impossible. And then came the final indignity. Madame du Barry, the king's last and most controversial mistress, was expelled from the palace. Once a powerful influence behind the throne, she was now considered a liability, both a symbol of scandal and a potential source of contagion. In his last days, the king drifted between moments of clarity and fever-induced delirium. He reportedly expressed regret, asked forgiveness from God and his people. But those moments of spiritual reckoning were fleeting, drowned out by the relentless decay of his body. What surrounded him was a vision of medieval horror, cries of pain, the stench of death, and then, on May 10, 1774, it was over. Louis XV, who had ruled France for nearly 60 years, died in agony. His body convulsed violently before going still. He died not as a sovereign, but as a man ravaged by disease, abandoned by dignity. The aftermath was a disgrace. There were no grand mourning rituals, no solemn bells, no national grief. Instead, in the streets of Paris, there were cheers. The man who had once been called Louis the Well-Beloved was now remembered with bitterness and relief. He left behind a nation weary of his excess, disgusted by his decline, and burdened by his debts. His corpse was in such horrific condition that embalmers could barely approach it. Traditional funeral rites were scrapped. A lead coffin was hastily sealed, not to preserve honor, but to contain the stench. There was no lying in state, no majestic farewell, only a quick, almost secretive journey to the royal burial site at St. Denis. The procession, if it could be called that, was a pale mockery of royal custom. Few nobles attended. Curious onlookers stared, not with reverence, but with grim fascination, even in death. The king's presence made others sick, literally, at the funeral. The stench from the sealed coffin caused several attendants to become ill. The bishop abbreviated the ceremony, unable to complete even the barest rituals. It was not a burial, it was a disposal. The monarchy had never looked so fragile, so vulnerable, so human. Contemporary writers and satirists did not miss the opportunity. Pamphlets circulated comparing Louis XV's pitiful end with the grandeur of Louis XIV's funeral. Where once stood the majestic Sun King, now lay a bloated, rotting symbol of decline. Versailles had gone from symbol of absolutist glory to a monument of moral rot. For his grandson, the young Louis XVI, the throne came not with a crown of glory, but with a mountain of debt, disillusionment, and national instability. The French monarchy, once held to be divine, now seemed mortal in the worst ways possible. And across Europe, the response was mixed. Foreign courts sent condolences, but whispered relief. France had lost a weak king. Perhaps something new, perhaps. Something better might arise in his place. But history had other plans. The death of Louis XV was more than the passing of a monarch. It was the death of an era, the death of illusions, the death of divine right, of royal untouchability. And as France plunged into crisis after crisis, one thing became clear. The Ancien regime would not survive much longer, and it all began in a dark, stinking room, where a king rotted before he died. The downfall of the French monarchy didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding collapse rooted in decades of mismanagement, privilege, and indifference. And much of that decay can be traced back to the reign of one man, Louis XV. By the time he died, the monarchy's inability to address fundamental economic problems had already set the stage for revolution. The deep social resentments that had taken root under his rule didn't die with him. They festered. The tax system remained inequitable. The nobility and clergy still held on to their privileges, and the gap between rich and poor only widened. His successor might have had good intentions, but good intentions weren't enough to overcome decades of royal neglect. And public frustration, the hatred that once focused on Louis XV as an individual, was easily redirected toward the institution of monarchy itself. After all, nothing seemed to change. Conditions didn't improve, hopes were quickly dashed, and so disillusionment turned into anger. Internationally, Louis XV had left behind a legacy of humiliation. France's colonial empire was in ruins. Its diplomatic influence had faded. Its rivals, especially Britain and Austria, were growing stronger. Even the decision to involve France in the American Revolution, meant to restore glory, only deepened the financial crisis. It was a gamble that brought no lasting gains, only more debt, more disillusionment, and more instability. But Louis XV's failures went far beyond policy. They were cultural, intellectual, and even symbolic. During his reign, Enlightenment thinkers had unleashed a tidal wave of criticism against absolute monarchy. These ideas had taken hold among France's educated elite. By the time Louis died in 1774, many no longer believed in the divine right of kings. The monarchy had lost its moral legitimacy, and replacing one monarch with another wouldn't be enough to change that. Even as his successor tried to reform, the very machinery of government resisted. The same obstacles that blocked Louis XV's half-hearted attempts at change now stood in the way again: entrenched privilege, corrupt institutions, and a bureaucracy unwilling to surrender its power. The structures that had once made France the most formidable power in Europe had become shackles, choking off any chance of renewal. His agonizing decline, his body rotting from smallpox as courtiers fled the stench, became a metaphor for a monarchy in decay. Revolutionary propaganda seized on that image. To them, it was proof that the system itself was diseased beyond redemption. And perhaps the most chilling part, the people rejoiced at their king's death. There were no riots, no mourning in the streets, just a quiet, open satisfaction that the man who had ruled so long and done so little was finally gone. It was a stunning demonstration of how far the monarchy had fallen in the hearts of its subjects. Even medicine and science played a role in dismantling royal mystique. The detailed public accounts of Louis's suffering revealed a simple, terrifying truth. Kings could suffer just like everyone else. There was no divine protection, no sacred barrier between monarch and man. In the face of disease, all were equal, and that realization, in a world still ruled by divine right ideology, was revolutionary. The transformation of Louis XV from beloved child king to despised ruler became a cautionary tale. His reign showed how absolute power, unmoored from accountability and deaf to the needs of the people, could lead even the strongest institution to ruin. His failure wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It exposed the fragility of power, built on force rather than consent. And his story didn't end with his death. The consequences of his reign rippled far beyond France's borders. The collapse of French power allowed Britain to expand, shifting global politics for generations. Meanwhile, France's weakness encouraged aggression from European rivals and planted the seeds of conflict across the continent at its core. Louis XV's reign offers a brutal lesson. When power is hoarded without responsibility, when reform is resisted until it's too late, collapse becomes inevitable. The same system that had elevated France under Louis XIV now crushed it under his successor. The old monarchy, unwilling to change, became its own executioner. And so, in the final years before revolution, the memory of Louis XV's diseased and despised fueled the fire of radical change. In pamphlets and paintings, in speeches and songs, the rotting king came to symbolize everything that was wrong with the ancien regime. His corpse, unceremoniously buried and quickly forgotten, became a warning that no crown, no matter how glittering, is immune to the judgment of history. His story is not just a footnote. It's a mirror reflecting the dangers of complacency, the costs of unaccountable power, and the truth that even the grandest of institutions can fall when they lose the trust of the people they were meant to serve. Louis XV died as a symbol not of triumph, but of failure. A king who once inspired hope became instead the embodiment of everything that needed to be swept away. And in doing so, he helped make the French Revolution not only possible, but inevitable.